Chapter 1. The House at the Edge of the Steppe. The wind moved like a great, invisible animal across the grasslands. It stirred the golden blades into rippling waves that shimmered in the warm afternoon light, rustling like whispers in an ancient tongue. Above, the sky stretched wide and unbroken, a dome of pale blue smudged with high, delicate clouds. The sun hung low, casting long shadows from the crooked fence posts that lined the path to the old house. The house stood alone at the edge of the steppe, where the tall grass met the beginning of a pine grove. Time had painted its wooden walls a soft, silvery gray, and moss had claimed the stones of the front steps. A narrow chimney, darkened with soot, curved slightly like a crooked finger, and smoke curled from it, even in the middle of spring. The air smelled of burning cedar and the faint sweetness of something roasting, perhaps chestnuts or yams. This was where Lera had come to live. She was 11 years old and quiet in that way children sometimes are when they've seen something they don't understand. Her mother had sent her here to stay with a relative no one in the city spoke of much, Auntie Yana, who lived in the wind house, as the neighbors called it. There were rumors that she talked to shadows, baked bread without flour, and never aged. Lera had always dismissed those stories. Now, standing in front of the house with a battered suitcase and a wrinkled paper note in her pocket, she wasn't so sure. Auntie Yana answered the door before Lera could knock. She was tall and thin, with skin like sun-baked clay and long black hair streaked with silver. Her eyes were a sharp green, flecked with gold like bits of mica. She wore a loose dress made from patterned fabric and a woolen shawl, despite the warmth of the day. "You're early," she said, her voice like dried leaves brushing stone. "Good. The fields don't wait." Lera blinked. The fields? But Auntie Yana had already turned and walked inside. The house smelled like smoke and honey and old wood. Its floors creaked softly beneath Lera's feet, and wind sighed through the cracks in the window frames. Bundles of herbs hung from the beams. Sage, thyme, and something peppery Lera didn't recognize. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a black kettle swayed gently over it on a hook. Auntie Yana lived alone, but the house didn't feel empty. There were old portraits whose eyes seemed to follow you, shelves of clay jars labeled in neat handwriting, and a large cupboard filled with mismatched teacups. Lera felt like she'd stepped into a story her grandmother might have told by lantern light. She was shown to a small room with a wide window facing a feather-stuffed mattress. A woven rug and a thick wool blanket made the space feel cozy, if a little strange. Her only neighbor seemed to be the wind, which sang gently through the grass like a lullaby. That night, she dreamed of fireflies dancing in the tall grass, and shadows shaped like animals watching from the edge of the pine trees. In the following days, Lera learned that the steppe had a rhythm of its own. She helped gather herbs in the morning, learned to light the stove with pine cones and dried dung, and fetched water from the well that sang quietly to itself at dawn. Auntie Yana never rushed, but she never waited either. Things happened when they were meant to, and the house was peculiar. At night, the fire in the hearth whispered. Sometimes it flickered in shapes, once in the form of a little fox, once like a pair of wings. When Lera asked about it, Auntie Yana only said, "Fire remembers. Be polite to it." Then there were the jars in the pantry, one of them refilled with flour no matter how often they baked. Another smelled like rain and, once opened, filled the kitchen with a scent of petrichor. When Lera tried to ask questions, Auntie Yana smiled and handed her a broom. "Don't trouble the house," she said. "It listens." On the 5th morning, Lera met Toma. He was a boy a little older than her, maybe 12 or 13, with untamed black curls and a freckled nose. He appeared outside the kitchen window one morning with a burlap sack of mushrooms slung over his shoulder and a toothy grin. "You're the city girl," he said as Auntie Yana opened the door. "Did you know your window faces the oldest path in the steppe?" Lera frowned. "It's just grass." Toma laughed. "That's what you think." He came by almost every morning after that, sometimes with mushrooms, sometimes with bits of carved wood, once with a baby owl wrapped in a scarf. He lived a few hills over with his grandfather, a beekeeper who smelled of smoke and beeswax. Toma knew every root and rock on the steppe, every place where the wind changed tone. "There are things out here," he told Lera one afternoon as they sat watching dragonflies hover over the grass. "Things that don't like being seen, but they're always there, especially now." "Now?" Toma hesitated, then leaned in and whispered, "Because of the fire." Lera turned to him. "What fire?" He didn't answer. It was a week later that Lera saw the spirit. She had woken early, unable to sleep. The sky was still violet, and mist pooled along the ground like spilled milk. She stepped outside in her slippers, wrapped in her coat, and wandered toward the edge of the pine grove. There, just past the line of trees, a figure stood among the reeds. It was tall, nearly twice her height, shaped like a person, but made entirely of flickering amber light. Its eyes were like coals, soft and glowing, and it watched her with a patience that made her skin tingle. Lera didn't move. The spirit raised its hand, long-fingered and weightless, and touched a single reed. It glowed briefly, then bloomed into flame without burning. The fire danced, golden and warm, then vanished, leaving the reed unharmed. The spirit tilted its head. Then it was gone. When Lera told Auntie Yana, the old woman only nodded. "You've seen the Firekeeper." "That's what it's called?" "One of many. The spirits of this land are older than even the grass. Most are asleep, but the Firekeeper wakes when something is unbalanced." "What's unbalanced?" Auntie Yana stirred the fire. "That's what you'll learn if you listen." The weeks that followed were stitched with small enchantments. Lera found footprints in the dirt shaped like hooves, though no animals had passed. Once she saw a mole pop from the ground and bow to her before vanishing. She learned that the well sang louder when it was about to rain. The pantry door sometimes opened on its own to reveal just what they needed, but something else began to stir too. Birds flew in strange formations, flocks wheeling as if fleeing something unseen. At night, the fire hissed. Auntie Yana left offerings of honey and salt on the windowsills. Even Toma grew quieter. One day, he led Lera to a burned patch of steppe. The grass was black and brittle, and the earth underneath had cracked. In the center of the scar stood a stone ring, old, worn smooth by centuries. "This happened last season," he whispered. "The fire started in the middle of the night. No one saw who lit it, but the old men say they felt something, like the land itself flinched." Lera knelt beside the stone. Something in it pulsed faintly beneath her fingers, like an old heartbeat. She looked up at Toma. "We should do something," she said. Toma's gaze was steady. "Then we'd better start listening." That night, Lera stood by the window, watching the wind pull through the grass like a hand over velvet. She thought of the Firekeeper, of the spirits no one named, of Auntie Yana's quiet warnings, and Toma's bold curiosity. She didn't know what was happening yet, but she felt it, like a thread being pulled tight. The fire in the hearth flickered, and in it she saw a shape, a flame with eyes watching her softly, not threatening, just waiting. And far out in the dark, a single reed lit up with fire and faded, as if someone, something was calling her. Chapter 2, Whispers Beneath the Ash. The wind had shifted. Lera noticed it first the next morning, when the grass no longer danced in waves, but pressed down as if something heavy had passed through in the night. Even the bird song had changed, no longer light and warbling, but cautious, like a question whispered too softly to be heard. Toma arrived at dawn, his curls damp with dew and his brows drawn low. "Something's wrong near the southern stones," he said before even saying hello. Auntie Yana paused while grinding dried herbs in a stone mortar. She looked up, her eyes glittering like mica. "Then you'd best go see, but take her with you." Lera was already pulling on her boots. The southern stones marked the edge of the old territory, where the steppe began to roll more sharply and thistles grew between stones. It was where Auntie Yana never let Lera go alone, and where Toma always walked with a carved stick dipped in ash. He never explained why. The grass grew strange there, brittle and dry even in the morning, humming faintly if you listened close. The air smelled of iron. They climbed a hill where vultures circled. Below, in a shallow hollow, a cluster of ancient stones stood like teeth. Most were broken, but in the center, one remained whole, a pillar etched with glyphs older than the village, and beneath it, something new, a spiral of burned grass, blackened and fresh. Lera knelt near the edge. The scorch marks were odd, not chaotic like a normal fire. These were deliberate, controlled. Toma pointed to a curved mark in the earth. "Claw." Lera shook her head. "Too long, more like a finger." She reached out to touch the edge of the ash, but a low hum stopped her. The air shimmered like heat, and the ground pulsed once beneath her hand. "Auntie Yana, it's awake," she whispered. Back at the house, Auntie Yana made tea with nettle and sage and spoke very little. Finally, she unhooked a lacquered box from a high shelf and set it down. "This hasn't happened since before you were born," she said. "The landroot is stirring." Lera frowned. "The what?" Auntie Yana opened the box. Inside was a folded map on ancient paper stained with age and drawn in looping, elegant ink. It showed the steppe, but not like any map Lera had seen. There were lines that moved like veins and tiny markings. Flames, leaves, stones with eyes. This is how the land remembers itself, Yana said. Not as we see it, but as it is. Beneath the grass, beneath the soil, something old sleeps, a spirit older than even the Firekeeper. We call it the land root. Toma leaned in. Why is it waking up? Because something is being stolen, said Yana, and the spirits do not forget theft. She turned to Lera. The Firekeeper marked you. That means you can speak with the roots, but not yet. First, you must see the hollow. The hollow was not on any map. They walked all day through the shifting light of the steppe until the grass grew short and the earth turned sandy. It was dusk when they found it, a crater in the earth like a fallen star, surrounded by cracked stone and bone-pale roots jutting from the soil. It pulsed, not like a heartbeat, but like breath. Lera felt her own breath catch. The air was thick with memory. As they stepped inside, the world hushed. Even the wind held back. Toma lit a lantern. Though no flame was needed, the roots glowed faintly, and within them flickered tiny movements, like spirits caught in dreaming. This is where the Firekeeper was born, said Yana, kneeling to press her palm to the ground, and where it will return if the balance breaks. Lera reached out to touch one of the roots. It was warm, and then she was no longer in the hollow. She stood in fire, not burning, not painful, but consuming, a world of golden flame and wind. Shapes moved, spirits with long limbs and eyes like stars, dancing and forming mountains and rivers from light. In the center, the Firekeeper towered, not a creature but a presence, a guardian with flame for a heart, and then an intruder, a shadow that stole without asking, a hand that reached into the roots and took something glowing. The land screamed in silence. Then she was back. Lera stumbled, gasping. The hollow faded, returning to stillness. Her palms glowed faintly. You saw it, Auntie Yana said. There's something missing, Lera said. From the roots. Something someone took. Toma looked at the cracked earth. But who? That night, the fire hissed in the hearth. Lera sat awake while the others slept, watching the flames. Then, slowly, the fire began to shape itself. A form stepped out, not the Firekeeper, but smaller, a child made of ember and soot. Who are you? Lera asked. The ember child tilted its head. I am what was left behind. Left behind where? The flames flickered. In the place where fire touched greed. Find the stone with 7 eyes, and it was gone. In the morning, Lera told Toma everything. They searched the map and found it, a mark almost erased. A cairn west of the village, known in legend as the Stone with 7 Eyes. It was a ruin, forgotten by most. By midday, they were there. The cairn had crumbled, but the stone still watched, etched with ancient symbols like eyes. And in the center, a hollow had been dug. Recently, someone had come, taken something. In the disturbed earth, they found a broken jar. Inside, ash. But it glowed faintly. It was fire magic, Toma said. Lera reached down and the ash shifted. A voice whispered, "Return it." "To where?" she asked. "To the heart." They returned to the hollow at sunset. Lera poured the ash into the earth. The roots sighed. A single flame rose, then vanished. Balance began to return. But far to the east, something watched. A figure cloaked in charred silk with eyes like smoke smiled. This is only the beginning. Chapter 3: Smoke in the Veins. The mornings after the hollow felt heavier. Lera found herself waking not to bird song, but to silence. The kind of silence that suggested listening was no longer a choice, but a necessity. She lay in her cot beneath a wool blanket, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling cast by the dying fire. Toma hadn't come by in 2 days. She told herself it was nothing, that maybe his grandfather needed help with the bees, but deep down, something itched. A whisper in her bones that the balance they had begun to mend had already begun to slip. Auntie Yana seemed unchanged, going about her business with the same quiet purpose, but Lera noticed her hands trembled slightly when she lit the hearth each morning, and the fire took longer to catch. The embers, once eager, now hesitated, as if reluctant to wake. On the 3rd morning, Lera found a note pinned to the door. "Meet me by the tree with the 3 roots. Urgent, come alone." It was signed only with a soot-marked spiral, the symbol Toma carved into his walking stick. The tree stood on the ridge above the whispering well, twisted and ancient, its roots like claws gripping the earth. Lera arrived at midday, breath visible in the strange cold wind that had begun to drift in from the east. Toma was already there, but not alone. Next to him stood a girl she had never seen before. She looked about their age, dressed in dark traveling clothes, with a short red scarf fluttering in the wind. Her hair was pale, almost white, blonde, tied with strands of black thread. But what drew Lera's gaze were her eyes, one brown, one a deep ember orange that flickered faintly. "Lera," Toma said, voice low. "This is Elsha. She's not from the village." "No," Elsa said calmly. "I'm from the Flame-Bound." Lera narrowed her eyes. "That's a story, an old one. My grandmother said the Flame-Bound were a myth." "They're real," Elsa said. "We lived hidden. Toma found me." "You found her?" Lera looked at Toma. He didn't meet her eyes. "She saved me." "When I followed the smoke," Lera crossed her arms. "What smoke?" Toma hesitated. "The smoke? That came from me." The confession came slowly, like something Toma had carried for too long. He had been having dreams, vivid ones, dreams where he stood in fire but didn't burn, dreams of voices calling his name from the earth, of roots curling around his arms, of spirits whispering not warnings but instructions. He had tried to ignore them, but then one night he woke to find his hands glowing, members flickering beneath his skin. He had panicked and fled, wandering into the steppe until he found the ruins beyond the east hills, and there he had met Elsha. "She controls it," Toma said. "The fire, she knows what it is." Elsha looked at Lera. "It's in him, fire spirit blood, maybe just a drop, but it's enough. That's why the Firekeeper stirred. He didn't just mark you, He was warning you. Toma is connected to what's waking up. Lera sat on a mossy stone trying to process it. Who carved whistles for birds and rescued owls, was part flame. But why didn't you say anything? She asked quietly. I didn't want it to be true, Toma muttered. What if I'm the reason the land is breaking? You're not, Elsha said, but you are part of it. Elsha told them of the Flamebound, a nomadic people who carried the ancient flame, who had once tended to the Firekeeper directly, but after the last war between earth and flame, they scattered, hunted by those who feared what fire could become if left unchecked. I'm the last of my line, she said, or so I thought, but then I found Toma, and I knew the fire was waking again, not to destroy, but to reclaim something that was stolen. Thuller's heart tightened. You mean the ash, the piece of the spirit that was taken? Elsha nodded. Yes, but that wasn't the only theft. Auntie Yana was waiting when they returned to the house. She said nothing at first, just watched Elsha carefully, then opened the door and let them inside. There was a new smell in the air, something sharp, resin, and scorched herbs. So it's true, she said at last. The flame-bound rise again. Elsha bowed. Not rise, return. Auntie Yana nodded grimly. Then you must see the Ember Tomb. Lera glanced up. The what? The place where the flame was buried long ago, where it was sealed so the land could sleep. But if the seals are breaking, the tomb must be opened and guarded. Toma spoke softly. Then we go tonight. The Ember Tomb lay beneath the twin hills, two mounds shaped like sleeping lions, with an old shrine between them. The villagers thought it was just a boundary marker. But when Auntie Yana poured salt and blood into the cracks between the shrine stones, the earth groaned. A hidden staircase opened, filled with smoke and whispering heat. They descended together. The air below was thick with warmth, not suffocating, but ancient. And at the heart of the tomb was a chamber of black stone, lined with glowing runes. In the center burned a single flame, suspended in air. Elsha knelt. This is a living ember, the last breath of the Firekeeper's first vessel. Toma approached. As he did, the ember pulsed, and then the flame entered him. He gasped, fell to his knees. His eyes burned gold. Don't touch him, Elsha shouted, but it was too late. Something within him had awakened. Memories not his own surged. Villages on fire, laughter made of cinders, betrayal from within. He saw a figure in charred silk, the same as Lera's vision, a fire wielder who had bound the flame not to protect but to control. That power still walked the step. Toma screamed, and when he stood, he was not the same. His eyes shimmered with heat. His veins flickered. The chamber lights bent toward him like grass in wind. Elsha looked terrified. He's becoming one of them. Not them, Auntie Yana whispered. He's becoming the vessel. Liuar stepped forward. Toma, are you still in there? He looked at her, and for a moment his voice returned. I don't know, he whispered, but the fire is angry, and it wants to burn what took from it. Who took? Elsha demanded. Toma's hand rose, unsteady, pointed east. There's a man, he said, the one in my dreams. He wears smoke like a cloak. He has part of the Firekeeper locked in a stone. Lera's breath caught. Then we have to find him. As they left the tomb, the wind shifted again, hotter now, more erratic, and on the distant horizon, smoke rose, black against the evening sky. The land was waking up, but not gently. Toma walked silently, flame curling faintly at his fingertips. Lera walked beside him, her heart heavy with questions, and Elsha followed behind, her hand on a hidden dagger, uncertain of who her new friend truly was anymore. The story had changed. The fire was no longer sleeping. It had chosen a vessel, and the step would never be the same. Chapter 4: The Ash That Speaks. They walked into the smoke. The air on the step had turned metallic, filled with a thick grayness that clung to their clothes and skin. The once golden grass now crackled underfoot, brittle and blackened at the tips. The fire had moved ahead of them, dancing across the horizon like a phantom army. Toma was silent. His eyes, now a faint glowing amber, scanned the scorched ridges. The ember-threaded marks on his arms had grown darker overnight, pulsing with an internal rhythm. He moved like someone halfway between human and something else. His gestures precise, too smooth, as if memory and instinct were beginning to replace thought. Lera watched him from the side, her chest tight with worry. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the ember tomb 2 nights ago. Elsa walked behind them, knife always within reach. She didn't trust him anymore, not fully. Lera couldn't blame her, and yet she still believed he was there, somewhere beneath the fire. They reached the ridge by dusk. Below them stretched a shallow valley where the fire had not yet touched. At its center sat a structure, an old prayer temple long abandoned, its stone walls half collapsed, overgrown with moss and tall dry weeds. But now torches burned around it, figures moved, 5 at least, maybe more, clad in cloaks of dark fabric, stained with soot, and among them walked one taller than the rest, with a wide-brimmed hat and a robe that shifted like smoke. Lera's stomach turned. "That's him," she whispered, "the one from our visions." "The Ashbinder," Elsha confirmed. "He has the stolen piece of the Firekeeper. I can feel it." Toma didn't answer. He took a step forward. "Toma," Lera said quickly, grabbing his wrist. "You can't just go down there." "I'm not going down," he said quietly, his voice low and resonant. "We are." Elsha stepped forward. "We need a plan. If the Ashbinder has part of the Firekeeper's essence, he'll be able to twist fire to his will. He may already know about Toma. He might be waiting." "He is," Toma said, staring into the valley. "He wants me to come." Lera frowned. "How do you know?" "Because I've been dreaming about him since I was 7. They waited for nightfall. When the last of the red sun dipped below the steppe, Elsha used her flame sight, a gift from her bloodline, to mark out the cloaked sentries in the dark. Lera and Toma crept closer along the dry creek bed, the crackle of scorched grass muffled by rising wind. The old temple stood quiet but charged inside. Torches burned with steady, unnatural flame, blue, white, and silent. They slipped in through the broken side wall. The central chamber, once a place of prayer and quiet chanting, now pulsed with raw magic. At its center stood a stone altar, upon it a glowing heartstone. It pulsed slowly, once every few seconds, like a captured heartbeat. Standing beside it was the ashbender. He turned before they could move. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said. His voice was dry and smoky, as though burned from within. His face was lined with ash patterns, and his eyes were the same color as dying coals. "Toma," he said, smiling faintly, "you're late." Toma stepped forward. The torchlight danced on his skin. "Why are you doing this?" Lera asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The ashbinder turned his head toward her. "Why does a fire burn? Because it must." "You stole a part of the Firekeeper," Elsha hissed. "I rescued it," he said. "The spirits of fire were meant to rule, not to sleep. For centuries they were buried by the earthbinders and their root-bound temples. They made fire into a servant, but fire was never meant to serve." He placed his hand gently on the heartstone. "This is its breath. I will awaken it with Toma's help." Toma froze. "No." The ashbinder tilted his head. "You carry the flame. You are its vessel. You've already begun to change. Do you think you can stop it?" "I'm not yours," Toma said, fire coiling around his hands. The ashbinder smiled. "Then let us see what your fire chooses." With a single motion, the heartstone flared blinding white. Toma staggered. The flame in his chest surged. He fell to his knees, gasping, the ember veins along his arms flaring bright. Elsha rushed forward, but an unseen force threw her back. Lera screamed. "Toma?" Toma clutched his head, and then a sound like a deep wind rushing through roots. A voice not his own echoed from his mouth. "I remember." Fire erupted, not from the ashbinder, but from Toma. It didn't burn the room, it hovered, like thought made visible. In it they saw shapes, memories, a child running through dry grass, a flame crying from within a jar, a figure in robes reaching deep into the earth to pluck out a beating core of light. Toma stood. The fire in his eyes was not rage, but sorrow. "You hurt them," he said, voice echoing. "The spirits? You ripped them apart." The ashbinder scowled. "They were wasted in the soil. They needed purpose. You wanted control." The ashbinder stepped forward, and then, in a single blur of movement, Elsha struck. She lunged from behind, her dagger glowing red hot. It caught the ashbinder's cloak and passed through. He turned to ash where it touched, a shadow intact, stepped out of the smoke. The real ashbinder had never truly been there, only a projection, a trick of flame and memory. Lera pulled Toma back. The heartstone now pulsed erratically. Cracks raced through it. "I was using it to bind more fire," Elsha gasped. "It's unstable." Toma reached forward. "I have to return it," he said. "Not destroy it. Return it." "To the hollow?" Lera asked. No, he said. To me. Elsha grabbed his arm. It could burn you out. Toma met her eyes. Or it could heal what he broke. And then he placed both hands on the stone. The fire rushed into him. The chamber shook. Roots burst through the cracked floor, coiling around the walls. From above, the roof crumbled in shafts of golden light. Outside, the wind roared. Lera covered her eyes. When she looked again, Toma was glowing like a lantern, and then he collapsed. They brought him back to the wind house. He didn't wake that night, or the next. His breathing was slow, steady, but faint light still flickered under his skin. Auntie Yana brewed healing teas and sang songs older than language. Elsha sat at the foot of his bed, watching over him. Lera couldn't sleep. She stepped outside into the wind. The step, for the first time in weeks, was quiet. The grass bent gently, soot washed away by new rain. Fireflies blinked in the distance. Then she heard it. A voice, faint, Lera! She turned. Toma stood by the well, but not the Toma in the house. This was his spirit. He smiled. I'm not gone. I'm just learning, remembering. She ran to him, tried to hug him, but her arms passed through. He looked at her with warmth. There's more. The fire was only part of it. The earth still holds pain, and the ash binder isn't done. But we stopped him, she said, for now. He turned toward the east. I'll come back, I promise. But when I do, I may not be the same. She reached out, but he was already fading. The wind picked up, and she was alone. Morning came, the hearth fire lit on its own, and in it, for the briefest moment, a small fox made of flame bowed its head to her. She bowed back. The fire remembers, and so would she. Chapter 5. Where the grass still glows. Spring returned to the steppe. The rains came gently at first, soaking into the blackened earth, softening the scorched places, and bringing life from beneath the ash. New grass began to push up from the soil, tender green shoots that bent in the wind and caught the morning dew. Birds returned, their songs cautious but sweet, and dragonflies danced over the shallow streams that had begun to fill again. The wind house, perched at the edge of the pine grove, felt lighter now, as if it had exhaled. But Toma still slept. Each morning, Lera visited his room. She would sit beside him with a bowl of warm broth or sweet rice and talk to him as though he could hear, about the weather, about the fox that had returned to the garden, about the ghost cat that Auntie Yana pretended not to notice sleeping on the windowsill. Elsha brought wildflowers, placing them in jars, and once carved a small wooden firebird, which she tucked beside his pillow. Days passed, then weeks, until one morning the fire in the hearth flared without warning. Lera rushed in. Toma was sitting up, blinking slowly. You're late, he said hoarsely. Lera burst into tears and laughed at the same time. He was thinner and pale, but the glow beneath his skin had faded to a gentle warmth. The ember marks remained on his arms, faint and golden like tattoos left by the sun. His eyes were his again, brown with flecks of gold, but entirely his. Elsha entered the room cautiously. When she saw him awake, she dropped the bowl she was carrying. "You idiot," she whispered, wiping her eyes fiercely. "You absolute brave idiot." Toma smiled weakly. "Glad to see you too." That evening, Auntie Yana made sweet dumplings with honey and roasted pumpkin, and they ate together under the stars on the wooden porch. The step hummed softly with new life. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Elsha brought out a small jar of fire nectar, an ancient flame-bound remedy, and raised it in a toast to those who returned. "And to those who waited," Lera added, clinking her cup. Toma sipped and let the fire settle warmly in his chest. "I dreamed while I was asleep," he said, "of the fire, of the roots. They were talking to each other again." Lera leaned in. "What did they say?" "That they forgave," he said simply, "even the ones who burned them. They don't want revenge, they want peace." Auntie Yana nodded quietly. "Spirits always want to be remembered, not feared." As spring deepened, life settled into something warm and slow. Toma worked in the garden, kneeling in the mud with his sleeves rolled up, coaxing herbs to sprout with the gentlest flicker of flame. The fire spirit within him had quieted. It no longer surged, no longer demanded. It listened now. Elsha chose to stay. She helped Auntie Yana repair the roof, wove new nets for drying herbs, and sometimes disappeared into the hills with her curved dagger and returned with rare roots and ancient feathers. She began teaching Lera how to read the old runes, how to sing to fire in its own tongue, and how to hear the step's breath in the patterns of the wind. Lera grew. She no longer felt like a visitor. The house was her home now. She knew where every floorboard creaked, which jars liked to be whispered to before opening, and which spirits enjoyed stories told by candlelight. One day, she woke before dawn, not from fear, but from peace, and she saw it. A fox made of flame curled on the hearth, watching her. It nodded once, then vanished in a flicker. The fire still remembered, and so did she. On the longest day of spring, the village held its first festival in years. The elders gathered in the circle of stones. Children wore flower crowns, and smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the sky. Toma played a wooden flute carved by his grandfather, and Elsha danced in spirals, her scarf trailing embers that never burned. Lera watched from the edge, heart full, and then she noticed something. A figure in a dark cloak, standing beneath a twisted tree. She approached slowly. Her heart pounded, but the figure bowed low. "I am not the Ashbinda," he said. "I am his brother. I came to return what he took." He held out a stone, small, glowing faintly. Lera took it. She recognized the hum, a sliver of the Firekeeper. "Why now?" she asked. "Because fire can't grow in chains, and he forgot that." Then the man disappeared into the grass. That night, they brought the stone to the hollow. Toma held it in his palms. It pulsed once, then melted into light and scattered into the roots. The hollow glowed, and in the firelight, they saw a great fox, larger than any beast, made of flame and wind. Watching them from the step, it bowed its head, then vanished into the stars. In the months that followed, letters came from the lowlands, from other villages, stories of strange flames that healed instead of burned, of children who could light candles with their breath, of old trees blooming after decades. The spirits were waking, but gently now, remembered, not feared. On a warm summer evening, Toma and Lera sat beneath the tree with 3 roots, watching the sunset. He picked up a small stone and held it to the light. "I think I know what I am now," he said. "What?" she asked. "Not a vessel, not a weapon, just someone who can listen to fire," she smiled, "and speak to it." They sat in silence. The grass swayed gently, the wind carried the scent of smoke and lilacs, and in the distance, over the hill, a small glowing fire walked the steppe alone, free and at peace. The end.